when we worry that our authentic self is not going to be accepted, we tend to start wearing masks. At a certain point, it gets exhausting, just like if you were constantly and perpetually on a stage and could never get off it. And anything that's exhausting you is probably not aligned with your whole self.
Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So, Antonia, I would say that of all the things that we do at Personality Hacker, when we're done with a podcast, like recording like we're doing right now, I am the most exhausted I ever am. I think it's not the hardest thing we do, but it's the most tiring thing we do.
Yeah.
And I think that's for a few reasons. I think it's we have to basically generate content almost like a message in a bottle. We have to like come up with an idea, a concept, content, and then we have to go quote unquote on stage. We have to go into more of a performance place where we have to have lights on and cameras, and it's staged. Like I'm not sitting how I'd normally sit if I was like comfortably watching a movie or I was chill. I have to curate, like I have to sit up straight. I have to be right in front of a microphone. I don't have a lot of range of motion. I have to be like basically a curated like person right now in order to engage on this podcast. So it's exhausting because I have to hold it almost like a pose. I have to hold this position, this frame. I've got to stay in good thoughts. You and I have to be in rapport. It's complex coordination between the two of us. Like, you know, if we make mistakes, that's an edit point, or if we say something that's uncalibrated, we have to go back and fix that. So I've got to be very careful of the things I say. I want to make sure that it's presented well. I take a shower, you know, I don't have my hair pulled back.
Right.
I like style it a little bit. You
Yeah.
do too. I try to dress nicer than I would if I was just walking around my house in sweatpants or something. So it's a very curated experience. And I've noticed that when I'm done, I'm like, it's almost like I've been sitting up straight on a chair and I can like slouch a little bit. And I was reflecting on this before we started today. And I was thinking to myself, why is this so hard? It's because of all that curation. And then I realized there are people that go through life curating every moment, just like I curate my experience on the podcast. I do it for performative reasons because we have to capture this moment, but they're doing it when the cameras aren't rolling.
Yeah.
When they're at work, when they're with their partner, when they're out with friends, they're curating things. And I notice that people feel exhausted all the time. They feel like they can't let their hair down. They feel like they can't relax, and it's starting to stress us out. I think our nervous systems are starting to take a hit on it. I don't know if you noticed other people that look like they're exhausted, or maybe they're not exhausted, but they somehow have been able to keep this up for a long period of time. I've noticed phenomena, and I can't imagine having to be in the state I'm in for a podcast indefinitely throughout my entire day or my week or my month.
Yeah. I would agree that it is, like you said, it's not the hardest thing we do, but it is sometimes the most tiring. And it's not harder than, say, running a live event.
No.
But being on stage, once you get to a place where like you've kind of made peace with all of that and get to a place where that's not terrifying in and of itself, now you have the audience to, their feedback and their goodwill. Like you've established goodwill with your audience.
Yeah.
We've not established goodwill necessarily with everybody who's listening to the podcast.
Yeah.
There might be people who are like very, anti or against something that we say.
Or this could be the first time somebody's listening. They don't know who we are yet.
Yeah,
they
exactly.
have to warm up to us.
Right. And we need to be really neutral about a lot of things. So we have to be careful not to, insert something that would be potentially triggering or not actually triggering.
Distracting.
Actually, I think we'd say triggering things quite a bit, or at least it feels like to me.
Yeah.
But divisive, I guess you could say, like something that maybe infuses some timely politics or social commentary. We were very careful not to do that because, as you said, we're kind of creating time capsules here, at least from our perspective.
Yeah.
And we want them to not be limited to whatever's going on in the world in the moment, because as soon as that's done, then nobody cares.
Yeah.
So we have to be careful not to be too divisive or bring in too much timely content. And so we're curating it that way. And then, like you said, it's like I do my hair and makeup every time. And in fact, actually, I look back and I'm like, why is my makeup not showing? And so then I mean, it's been years that I keep trying to, I put more and more and more makeup on, trying to get it to show up on camera. And I'm like, wow, there's a lot of makeup that you have to wear in order to have it show up on camera. And so these are things that I'm trying to learn. And yeah, it's very much curated to, like you said, to not be distracting.
I'm really glad you said that about makeup.
Yeah.
I think that's going to kick us off today. I know today we want to talk about persona, this Jungian concept of persona. And I'm I'm talking about how we have a curated persona here.
Yeah.
We have to show up with for a podcast. I'm a podcaster here. I'm not a dad. I'm not a coworker. I'm not a spouse or a partner. I'm a podcaster, and we have to be in a certain framework and a certain persona. And you just said something. I keep looking on the camera to see my makeup show up. And what's interesting about that, it makes me think of where the word, or at least the concept of persona and some of the ideas we have around it came from. And I'll start with the illustration and we can get into some of the details here. But we know in ancient Greece, or in the time period of the Greek tragedies and the plays and the comedies that were put on, they didn't have microphones or television cameras or movie cameras. So they had to amplify the emotions from a great distance at the theater productions. And so that comment you just made about, is my makeup showing up on camera, makes me think of ancient Greece and some of the techniques they had to use to project their voice and project the emotional state they were in for a theater. A gigantic theater didn't have amplification systems like modern day technology.
Right.
So they had to amplify in other ways. They used masks, voice projection techniques, and all of these things like acoustics to basically communicate at great distance to the audience that is there.
Yep.
And in a way, you're saying, well, the camera is like great distance for my makeup. I have to maybe put on more makeup than I would if I went out just in the evening.
Yep.
Because I'm having to play to a larger, bigger space. I have to communicate myself great distance in a way.
Yeah. Like
in an analogy or metaphor. And so then makeup in movies, this is the same thing. All the actors are wearing makeup in movies, but they may not wear that the same way in real life.
Right, exactly. So, and so the word that I'm sure you're teeing me up to use is the word mask, which is, so the word persona, the Jungian term persona, comes from the Greek word mask. And in the same way that you just mentioned, the concept of persona, and I'm sorry if I went on too long and was getting boring. And that's why you jumped in there, because I was actually going to build on that idea that you were mentioning around some people are there all the time and it's exhausting.
Yes.
And so if you have to hold a stance, it would be kind of like being on stage all the time. And that's what it feels like when we worry that our authentic self is not going to be accepted by the world, then we do tend to take on a very curated persona. We tend to start wearing masks. And when they are not adaptable, when they feel like they have to be a performance at a certain point, it gets exhausting, just like if you were constantly and perpetually on a stage and could never get off.
Yeah.
And so this idea of persona has gotten a bad rap. It's almost like we're not supposed to have a persona because that's the fake part of us. And yet, as you mentioned, when you had a mask in ancient Greece, and I can't remember there's that like kind of famous, it almost always is advertising a theater. It's like the happy face and the sad face of the Greek,
the
theater.
Masks. Yeah.
But there's like a specific name for them. I can't remember what they are. My brain is going to try to remember it. And unfortunately, I'm just going to have to tell my brain, okay, stop trying to remember the name, because I never remember the name.
Yeah.
But those masks came to typify those performances because, like you said, they facilitated them. They had amplification in the mask itself. And so the mask would make it so that people, like you mentioned, at the back of the theater could still hear the voice of the actors. And they were very exaggerated emotions, like huge happy faces or sad faces, so that people at the back of the theater could get what was going on. And so there's good things that come from a persona, which is amplification of a part of who you are when you're interfacing with the outside world.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's also a danger to that, which you can see when you're in one that feels like a constant performance. You get exhausted, and anything that's exhausting you is probably not aligned with your whole self.
Yes.
So then I guess the question that gets begged is a persona a good or bad thing? Right? Is it a good thing for communication, or is it a bad thing because that it's not always how you feel your whole self is?
Yeah, I think most people, without thinking too deeply about it, if you didn't know what you're talking about or what you're looking at, would go, persona is always a bad thing. It's always bad to have fakery or inauthenticity. Again, this is how people are going to code it for themselves. you and I know that it's not fake or inauthentic to necessarily have a persona. Or am I being fake right now because I've got a microphone and I'm sitting still and we're having a conversation that's very curated with lights on and cameras?
Right.
No, it's a curated form. It's more formal than if you and I were just talking casually downstairs on our couch in our house or something, or over dinner.
Yeah.
But it's not inauthentic to be in a performative way or present something. And I think it's very valuable, in fact. And you can even see the nature of this. I think people are pushing more and more for authenticity. Think about what we would be doing if this was 15, 20 years ago, recording like a TV show for the internet, or a video for the internet. We do this audio and video, but these mics it'd be weird to have this here. Like if you watch a TV show, like one of the late shows, there's a microphone sitting on the table, like on the desk, but they don't have like boom mics and mics right up against their faces. That's very podcasty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's become normalized to have the equipment in the shot.
Yeah.
There's not a boom mic above us. Like it's okay to show the shot. It's okay to show the cameras. It's okay to show the equipment and the recording and the experience. That's part of the persona of being a podcaster now.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you didn't have these people, like they wouldn't put you in the category of podcaster. So I think persona is also something that there's some expectation to it. People expect us to show up, or we expect ourselves to show up in certain ways. And so we curate or perform ourselves to showcase, okay, this is the category I'm in. Yeah. I'm doing a podcast because I'm sitting in front of a microphone talking to Antonia on chairs, poised in front of cameras and mics.
Yep.
It would be weird for us to have like a conversation about our relationship or personal conversation around our kids. Like, oh, let's go in the podcast studio, kick on the lights and have that conversation with the mics. It'd be like, you'd be like, Joel, that's weird. I don't want to do that. I would feel inauthentic at that point.
Right.
So I know we just kind of went on a bunch of different tangents, talked about a bunch of different subjects. I opened a bunch of different loops just to kind of talk about demonstration, some illustration to see, okay, what are we actually talking about here from like a lived experience type of way? Maybe now is time to go into more definitions, Jungian stuff. Let's talk about what is persona a good thing? What do we talk about? How would we define it? Do you want to jump into that?
Yeah. And I also...
Why are we even talking about today too, right?
Yes.
Like, what's the point?
Why are we talking about it? And what is the benefit of understanding Jung's archetype of persona? So Jung had 4 primary archetypes that I think are easy to overlook for type enthusiasts who mostly understand Carl Jung's work in terms of cognitive functions. So cognitive functions are like a bedrock concept for Myers-Briggs personality types. And there's something that we talk about endlessly over the last 10 years on the podcast. So if you've never heard about cognitive functions, then there's an endless source of them in the podcast and all over the internet. That's the beginning and end of what a lot of type enthusiasts know about Jung's work. But Jung's work goes way, way deeper, and it is the source code for type, in my opinion, or the Myers-Briggs or 16 personalities version of type. So there is a lot of value diving into that source code. There's a lot of value in understanding what was at the beginning or the point of inception, or the other ideas that were being worked on while he was understanding cognitive functions. And these 4 archetypes of self, persona, ego, shadow, and whole self, were, I would say, some of the most accessible, but at the same time profound ideas that he came up with. And so I always just find it interesting just intrinsically, but the further down the rabbit's hole of Jung's work I get, the more I realize that these are like algorithms for having a good experience in life, honestly. So we've done a whole podcast, I believe, on those 4 archetypes, so you can look it up. I think it is actually called Persona, Ego, Shadow, and Whole Self, where we've laid each out. But I think persona needs to be given special attention in and of itself. And the reason why is if we get this concept down, if we understand it, if we do it right, it kicks off a domino effect that eventually gets us to a place of what I call wise older leadership. So it's like the beginning of this sort of series of things we need to establish in our life to get to a place where we are qualified to dispense wise counsel and wise modeling and wise leadership in our elderhood. If you're a young person, that might not be interesting to you at all. But I will say I find a lot of young people to be highly interested in the concept of shadow work. Yeah. And shadow work comes after persona work. And so if you really want to do shadow work, do persona work first. In fact, it's required in order to get there. So that's why we're talking about persona. We're talking about it not just because it's an interesting theoretical model, but because it's actually one of the most important things that we can establish a good relationship to persona and a good understanding of what it is in order to effectively have a successful life.
It's because the way we show up, well, not just to others, but to ourselves, matters. Like it informs the inner space. The outer space informs the inner space, is what I hear you saying in a little bit of a way, right? Like I think that you connected this to ego. You said persona, or excuse me, shadow. If you want to do shadow work, we do persona work first.
Mm-hmm.
It immediately made me think of, I saw this video online on YouTube with this guy who would go around and work with homeless people who were struggling, and we'd help them get haircuts and get new clothes and a haircut so they could go and find jobs and help them polish up their resume. And it's really interesting to watch the video when the person gets a haircut, they get a shave, a nice pair of nice new clothes. They look so different. Their hair's combed and looks really nice. And some it's very emotional experience. They look at themselves and they have this emotional experience of seeing themselves in this different persona.
Right.
And it's because it reflects the inner space. It's actually touching something very deep inside their shadow, most likely. Mm-hmm. And somebody that's in that state, a lot of these people are struggling with addiction or really bad circumstances. They have a lot of healing to do and a lot of shadow work to do. And this guy doesn't go in and start counseling directly to the shadow. He just helps them get their persona dialed in first. Mm-hmm. To your point, it's the first step to go into the deeper work, the stuff that's under the hood.
Yeah.
This is the place to start.
Yep.
Especially if you're young. Because it's kind of the work to do when you're young, a young adult, a teenager, somebody that's in your youth. This is available to you to work on your persona.
Yeah.
So let's go another layer deeper. Where do we go from here?
Okay. So that was the why. And so let's enter the what. What is persona? How did Jung define persona? Well, your persona isn't necessarily an insincere or fake part of you.
Yeah.
It's, you could call it sort of selective authenticity. It's the part of yourself that you're choosing to show to this context at any given time. So by this context, I mean whatever environment or context you're in at the moment. So you could almost see it as the interface. It's if we're on one side and everybody and everything else is on the outside, and you could almost call this introversion versus extroversion. Introversion is us and a relationship to ourselves and all the things that are inside. And extroversion is everything on the outside. Persona is your interface of those two worlds. It's you bringing yourself to a situation and in an environment, and then trying to find the best, bridge between those two concepts, like the me that I show up with at any given moment. So, what are different contexts and environments? Well, the office is an environment, right? And you're going to show up a certain way when you go to the office. School is an environment. So you're going to show up a certain way when you get to school.
How about a Zoom call?
A Zoom call is an environment. You're going to show up a certain way.
My background is curated properly, right?
Yeah. Your family is an environment. Your partnership or your relationship and your marriage is an environment. Like there's all these different environments we find ourselves in. And we know that how we show up with our families or our kids is not necessarily the right way to show up with, office mates. So we recognize the idea of showing a different slice of ourselves or a different aspect of ourselves depending upon what the context itself is asking for. So it's like selective authenticity. Now, does that mean that I'm fake in the way that I'm showing up at the office? Well, I wouldn't be able to show up in that way if I didn't find a part of myself. So I can't show up with something that isn't inside. So whatever I'm showing up with is a part of me.
Yeah.
The challenge is when it gets a little too pinned on, a little too curated, a little too selective. When it's not showing any part of ourselves, when there's no vulnerability or sincerity in there, there's just like a one very, very, like you use the word curated, one very curated aspect. And that we bring that to most contexts, right? Like we don't become flexible. We don't adapt to the environment. We just bring that same version to most situations. Now, when that happens, there will oftentimes be like one environment where that environment gets the quote unquote real us. And usually that environment doesn't get a very good version of us because we're exhausted from having performed in every other situation. Usually that one environment gets the worst of us. I see this as, parents that maybe are pillars of the community and show up as these amazing people for everyone else, and then go home and speak abusively to their children and partners, or they're just kind of awful people at home. Well, they pinned on a very curated persona everywhere else. And then when they got home, that they couldn't sustain that, and all the icky stuff now comes out. So an overly curated persona is usually exhausting, and it doesn't it's not sustainable all the time.
Yeah. Well, and that's an unhealthy persona that's
Right.
not sustainable. I mean, you can sustain a persona if it's backed by realness and you're more authentic to it, right? Your situation, your context, all the things that help you curate it, that you're matching your world, and it makes sense for that. You know, I think that's a healthier version. You were saying, you know, is it inauthentic to go to work and showcase a certain persona? In some ways, that it's even more authentic. There's a part of me that has a very professional part that likes to be kind of in the office environment, right? Maybe my effectiveness 10-year-old and my ENFP personality wants to be more professional and wants to showcase a very professional side of me. At home, I don't get the opportunity to do that. With my kids, I don't get the opportunity to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I get an office job, or I have a context where I have to go into a presentation in a corporate environment. Well, there's a part of me that's very authentic that gets to now showcase itself in that arena, that if I didn't have that arena, I wouldn't be able to showcase that. So the context, I don't think it just, like, I don't think persona is inauthentic. In fact, I think it actually allows us to be more authentic.
Yeah.
It's, to your point, what you said before, is not to get stuck in one slice of it, one showcase of it. It's, can I be professional when I'm in the professional setting? Can I be chill with my kids when I'm in that setting as a dad? Do I have this range of ways of being? Because my younger self would immediately thought that's a chameleon. That's a person that just doesn't stand for anything, wishy-washy. They're two-faced. They're showing this face at work. They're showing this face at home. They're actually not to be trusted. That's how I would have represented that kind of a person in the past.
Right.
But I've updated that to say, no, that's actually a mature person that's bringing out the right part of themselves to the right context.
Right, because a healthy persona is adaptable.
Yeah.
And it's flexible. And so it's going to adapt and flex based on our values, the context, but also, like you're talking about, the role we play. Like a version of what you're talking about is maybe like a school teacher that at school chooses to highlight patience.
Yeah.
And maybe not give their problems over to the kids that they're working with. Like, they're going to maybe shield or hide their personal problems at home from the kids they're working with, and then front face their patients. That's if you didn't do that, everybody would say you're a terrible teacher.
Yeah.
So we do this depending upon what the environment needs of us. But at the same time, it also makes me think of the Krishnamurti quote that says, it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And so if the environment that we're in has us questioning or maybe trying to compromise our values, or we feel like the society around us or the context around us is, as he would have said, sick, right? Then maybe standing against it is part of our persona. Like, we're choosing to show up with the values part of us that says, this is not all right, and I'm not okay with that. That's still you interfacing with the outside world. It's still like the stance you've taken. So it doesn't mean that you're a chameleon and that you're entirely handing your identity over to the environment. It's that you're doing a read on the environment and trying to meet it halfway. But not, like what you're talking about, the chameleon that doesn't stand for anything, that's a person who's meeting the environment all the way. But an individual that says, no, the environment needs to meet me on my terms, is somebody who is now asking the world to do the same thing, only the opposite direction. So that's why that concept of interface and bridge is so important. But it also makes it harder. If you are just going to hand yourself over to the environment, that means you don't have to do much thinking. You don't have to show any discretion. You just go, whatever the environment wants from me, I'll give. You don't have to really think. You just have to react or respond. And then the other side is also true. If you're just going to stand for whatever you stand for and everybody has to, sort of suck it up, you don't have to think much. You don't have to show any discretion or discernment. You just show up with whatever you think is right at any given moment, and everybody else can I can't think of the phrase that isn't a swear word, but
Go away.
Yeah, they can all go away. Right. So, so anyway, I don't know why that phrase just keeps going in my head over and over again, but I'm not going to do that because I'm going to curate my persona enough to not swear egregiously in this episode. So, both of those are easier to do, even though the consequences are worse. They're easier to do because you don't have to show up any thought or discretion. When you have a healthy persona, it requires something of us. It requires of us to be calibrating all the time. Is this a situation where I need to show up with my personal values, or is this a situation where it kind of doesn't matter and I can be more accommodating to the environment? If a person had authenticity as a value, but they're a school teacher and they're going through a rough time and they make all of their students like listen to their sob story because that's how they're actually feeling right now, and that's a sincere feeling. Well, we wouldn't say that that's a values-based decision, even though they might, because my value is authenticity or sincere expression of feelings. So it's not just our values we have to take into consideration. It's also societal values that we take into consideration.
Yeah.
And when we do that, when we do the hard work of discretion and flexibility and adaptability and doing the thought labor as we're going, then we are what Carl Jung would call fit for life. We are now, we're putting ourselves in a position of success without compromising our individual values, without compromising ourselves, but at the same time, not forcing ourselves on the world so that the world rejects us. And so we're setting ourselves up by playing this balancing game, we're setting ourselves up for the best possible scenario.
And it feels like how this is connected to personality type is our personality type can show us more aspects of ourselves. It's a good starting map, especially when you're young, maybe before you're ready for shadow work and some of the deeper truths that you're not ready to face yet. You just want to know, okay, how am I wired? What are my natural ways of showing up? What are all the parts of me that I can showcase to the world?
Mm-hmm.
And I think personality type, especially our first four functions, our car model, driver, co-pilot, 10-year-old, 3-year-old, in the cognitive function stack, I think this can really give us information about how we can show up interface. Because as we're talking, I'm just running the narratives in my head of the pushback, both for myself and other people, right? Like I think a lot of this pushback in the world is pushback against forced persona.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can't tell you how many times I've heard women say, as a woman, I'm expected to do all the emotional labor for people in my life. I'm expected to pin a smile on no matter how I'm feeling. I'm expected to look nice and pretty, or, put my hair and makeup together and look nice for everybody. Like, I feel a lot of women I hear will report, they feel almost like, not assaulted, but like required or like commanded by society to follow all of these rules. Men have it too. I just happen to choose women. Like men have their own version of this.
Yeah, for sure.
But a lot of women will report this and they're like, I don't want to, like, I'm tired. Like, it feels like it's an old school way of thinking. I'm tired of doing this. I'm tired of, when somebody asks how I'm doing, being polite all the time or like shining it on all the time. Can I just naturally be how I really am? Mm-hmm. Do I have to smile? Do I have to do this? It feels like this persona work is being forced upon us. And I think there's a backlash to it in our society. To say, I'm not going to do that anymore.
Yeah.
I'm not just going to play this game because I'm expected to.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of understandable, but at the same time, I also suspect that it is, that kind of feeling is built on poor persona work or imbalanced persona work to begin with.
So it's not less persona. It's like you even need even more of it.
Yeah. Well, you need better of it.
Do it better for yourself. Don't let other people do it for you. Take control of the process for yourself.
That's right.
That's really what we're saying.
Yeah. The pushback against, I don't want to have to be all things to all people should not be, I don't want to show up at all with any expectations. And I don't think anybody's really saying that. I mean, some people might initially, when they recognize that they don't have to be all things to all people, might go a 180.
Yeah.
But most of the time, I think what people are effectively saying is that I'd like to have a more balanced relationship with my persona, a healthier one. And that's right in alignment with Jung's recommendation for our relationship to persona, because an imbalanced persona actually, and this is why we say that it's connected to, or why I said it was connected to a better elderhood experience down the line, and then shadow work somewhere in the middle. The relationship between all of these things is that if our persona is imbalanced, then what ends up happening is we end up building up shadow material from disowned parts. So what is the shadow? Well, the shadow is anything about ourselves that we are unconscious or unaware of.
Good and bad.
Yeah, good and bad.
Not just bad stuff. Its
Yes.
shadow makes it think, oh, it's all bad. But no, it's like your good qualities too you're unaware of.
Right. Well, anything you're not ready to contend with yet.
Yeah.
Right. And a bunch of unprocessed material. And so sometimes unprocessed material is positive. So it doesn't just have to be bad news, but it feels like bad news. It feels like material you are not ready to see about yourself at this time. And if our persona is imbalanced, what that means, and we kind of talked about the two sides of this. One is it's overly rigid and pinned on and buttoned up, and you just show a very curated version of yourself to everyone. And I guess a practical example of that is like somebody who you never see not smiling. Like they're just constantly pleasant face, smile, chipper, happy all the time. You've never seen them crack. You've never seen them break. They're just always in this mood all the time for everybody, always. And I'm sure that's not the case when they go home, but they've got this very, very curated, very like sort of this is as selectively authentic as they're willing to be. And so that's a rigid, non-flexible persona. On the other side is a persona that almost doesn't exist. It's the one where you can almost, I mean, I think of it as like, I don't know, sort of the Gen X version of it, which is nihilistic and I don't care what you think about me, and you know everybody else can go screw themselves because I'm just me and I'm not going to sell out or whatever, you know, when we were all teenagers. So there's that version which pushes everybody and everything away and goes, you need to meet me entirely on my terms.
Yeah.
The challenge with that is, as mentioned, there's no discretion involved. And so when the world reflects something back to you, in the first case, if the world reflects feedback and you don't like it, when your persona is too curated, you can just say, well, they don't know the real me anyway. So anything that is anything that's material about yourself that you can't see on your own must be reflected back by the environment, because that's basically what a shadow is. A shadow is something that requires a light source in order for it to be seen. And so if somebody is shining a light on you and showing your shadow, it's like now the shadow is showing up and you can see it, but you don't want to, then you can very quickly disown that by saying, well, they're not really reflecting the real me because they don't know the real me, because I'm not showing them the real me. So now if they were reflecting something real back, you very conveniently gave yourself an out on not having to look at it. On the other side, when you are requiring everybody to come all the way to you, then you're not actually taking in any feedback. You've just sort of written them out to begin with. You're like, well, you don't know me and you don't get to say anything about me. And you've like just in the strategy itself, you've written out feedback.
Yeah.
So when personas are too curated, too rigid, or too self-centered and not meeting the world halfway, then you build up all of this shadow material. It's basically like plaque, right? It's all this, you know, you just sort of built up all of this shadow material waiting for you later on down the line to look at it. And if you build up too much, then when you get an opportunity to actually look at it, which is something that I think is inevitable and happens, which we can talk about in a moment, it will feel so burdensome. The likelihood of you choosing to not do that work is exceptionally high.
Yeah.
And persona work starts, I would argue persona work starts around the sociosexual circuit. So what I'm referring to is the 8 circuit model from Timothy Leary. And that happens around puberty. Yeah. So our persona really starts to kick on around puberty. That means your entire youth and young adulthood is your opportunity to work on your persona. Now, we're young at that time, and we're still very influenced by our caretakers. And the younger we are, the more our persona is going to be an attempt to make people around us happy in some way, or reject it, right? Or rebel against it. But we're still very tied to our caretakers and the biggest influences in our life for modeling our persona, or crafting it. The older we get, the more of an opportunity we get to start to take over the process and go, okay, who am I really? And what am I really going to show to everybody? So when we're young, we have a unique opportunity to create a persona that down the line does not have all of this baggage just waiting for us to look at it. We can shrink our shadow. We can not have all of this plaque built up for later. if we have a good relationship to persona.
Yeah.
But that means discretion, discernment, thought, and authenticity, like true not the everybody come to me because I shouldn't have to meet the world halfway, but like the real thing, the real authentic desire to sync up with our environment and show a part of ourselves that is appropriate for that particular context.
So the image I got in my head as you were talking about showcasing to the world something that won't reflect a lot of shadow is almost like if I'm facing a light, like the sun, and I'm casting a shadow behind me, and I wanted to cast a thinner shadow, I might turn sideways and stand sideways. So I cast the thinnest, I want to present the thinnest, most narrow persona possible toward the light to have the thinnest shadow to have to contend with.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this idea of the more curated and the more tightened up. I don't mean to do this to real estate agents, but I always think of real estate agents as very curated personas just because of the one South Park episode where they made fun of it.
Right.
I know there's real estate agents that aren't just always in persona, but for some reason that's the image. It's the image I have in my head of that, like in South Park where they're like posing on the billboards to kind of be in their, I don't know. It's just a funny scene. But I think in terms of like, the overly curated, overly professional face that someone might put on, again, no shade to real estate agents. That's just kind of the thought I have in my head. Where you're basically saying, I'm so nice, I'm so kind, I'm so curated that you can't find any fault with this. The shadow is so thin that I'm casting in the light here that even if there was a shadow, it's not going to have much content because I've just really given you a very, very thin slice of curated experience of me.
Yeah.
Now, so that's one way to say it is we diminish the shadow that's there. But the thing you're saying is if we do happen to cast a wide shadow by presenting a persona that's a little bit more wide, it looks more real than that really thin, almost NPC type shadow.
Mm-hmm.
We can just say, well, that's fake. It's in a way we almost embrace the fakery and we say, well, that was just a performance. That was completely me. That was my stage presentation, or that was my politician mode, or that was maybe politicians are better than real estate agents for persona slice. That's probably better because I don't want to pick on real estate agents. Right. I have no beef against them. It's fine. But politicians are very curated personas that have a thin shadow they're trying to cast, which we know there's a crap ton of shadow in a politician's life, right? Yep. That's why they're trying to cast this very thin persona because we know how much garbage is behind it all. And they know it too. Yep. And so they're like, don't look at any of it. But if they already cast something wide, they go, well, that really wasn't me. That was me in my speech-making mode or my politician mode or my whatever mode. That's not legit.
Yeah.
That big shadow you see, that was all fake because my persona was fake. So you can't point to that and say that's something I got to deal with because my persona wasn't even real. Mm-hmm. And so in a way, if we're not willing to contend with our shadow, we want people to see us as fake from our personas. We don't want them to think that's our real self.
Yeah. We
like the fact that they don't really know who we really are. It's almost like a defense mechanism now of a way to cast, like, I show you a non-reality of who I am, and then you can't call me on anything because none of that was me.
Yep.
I tell myself, even though it is me, but that's how we get out of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Carl Jung mentioned that the persona is a social mask that is crafted to adapt to social expectations and meet the world halfway. It's a tool of adaptation. So it tries to balance the needs of the individual and society, right? It's trying to find a halfway point. It is also, he mentioned in many quotes that it's a concealer of the true self, right? So if we want to hide our true self in the same way that you're talking about right now, so and if that's the case, if that's how we use the persona, then it will limit self-awareness and growth. He also talks about it being a potential trap. And the trap is not when we say, oh, they didn't know the real me the whole time. The trap is actually when we over-identify with it and say that is the real me. We do have this sort of chirpy, no, this is me. I'm happy and bubbly all the time. That would be over-identifying with our persona, not giving ourselves credit for the full range of human emotions and experiences. And it doesn't even have to be the happy, chirpy person. It can also just be the gruff person who's just constantly grumpy and pretending that, everybody and everything is making them grumpy. I mean, I know somebody who has carefully crafted the persona of a grumpy middle-aged guy because there were a lot of those people in his industry. And so he's trying to emulate people and model people who came before him. And so that's the role. The role is that in his industry, everybody's this grumpy guy, this grumpy middle-aged person, whether it's a man or a woman. And so that's their version of this. And so they've over-identified with a single role or over-identified with a certain affectation. And that's a warning that Jung talks about over and over and over. But it is also a reflection of the collective psyche, right? Which means that it's mediating the individual and the external world. And so we're all kind of bouncing our personas off on each other. And our persona can be individual, but it can also, like, entire civilizations or societies can have a persona as well. And so that's a piece of it. A piece of it is that we're kind of all playing this persona game together to create a set point, and that you can almost argue that that's what culture is. Culture is our shared collective persona together that we put to the rest of the world. Right? These are our differences, and it's not entirely that. That's a very reductionist way of looking at culture, but there is a piece of that. There is a piece of our front facing with how we look to the rest of the world. And he also mentioned that it is linked to the shadow in the way that we're talking about. Right? It's like it's almost like a seesaw. The less balanced or I would say the less adaptation that we have in our persona, the more shadow content is going to build over time. And the more flexible our persona, the less shadow content that we'll have. We'll all have shadow content. That's not something that can go away. But it's just how much do you want to have to deal with or contend with as you age or get older, and then it starts to be reflected back in a real way.
Yeah.
So that's Jung's concept of persona. And then he also mentions that it needs to be, I want to actually find the quote because I think it's such a good one.
Yeah.
He says in 2 essays on analytical psychology that the dissolution of the persona is therefore absolutely indispensable for individuation. So he says that we need to dissolve the persona, which is a very interesting word to use. So what does it mean to dissolve?
That's a alchemy. Like, dissolve is an alchemy word. Well, not particularly alchemy, but
right.
it's not destroying it, or
right?
Ridding yourself of it.
Right, exactly. It's not it's not destroying. It's not destruction. It's dissolution. It's dissolving.
Transfer of energy to something else.
Exactly, because in that same quote, he follows it with, but one must be careful to see this as this apparently negative process followed by a positive advance. For experience shows that the loosening of the persona is only a means to the end. The end is that hiatus which follows when we shed our surface, which is what we are in the eyes of the world. And then he also says that the individual must be careful to build up a new persona that is adequate to the demands of life. For without a persona, he can no longer exist socially in a human community. So while Jung talks a lot about how the persona is a trap, he also says, and also we can't live without it. So just like persona itself is a meeting of two worlds, persona, and it requires balancing, right? It requires discretion and balance and trying to figure out sort of the right, how much do I bring in this context? How much do I bring more of myself, or how much do I accommodate more of the environment? We always have to be thinking in those terms.
Yeah. The
concept of persona itself is a balancing act, right? We have to make sure that we're not over-identifying with it. We also have to make sure that that we understand its purpose, and that we are honoring and have a respect for the fact that this is how we get along in life. We have to dissolve it, but we can't destroy it. We have to make sure that the world sees our real self, but not too much of our real self. Like, there's a lot of balancing act in all of this, which is why most people, it's hard. Most people aren't doing this work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's only harder now because we, for some reason as a culture, I think expectation helps us curate a persona, and then we can work on it later in life. But without expectation, we're not sure what to do as young people.
Yeah.
So when the adults around us and society around us says, listen, there's no expectation, or any expectation that you hear, just ignore that and do whatever you want, I actually think it hurts us. Like, it's better to even have the wrong expectation, honestly, for a young person to wire themselves to, and then they can always ameliorate or change that later. But to have no expectations, almost worse than having the wrong one.
Yes.
As an example, I think both of us grew up with a lot of gender expectations, like how a woman or how a man should behave, what they should be attuned to, how they should behave. Now, we may disagree like fundamentally about that projection of expectation onto us. And I think you and I do. We have some question marks around gender roles that were projected onto us. But to throw out all of them just because they're expected is dumb, just like embracing all of them is dumb.
Right.
I think our job now, especially in midlife, is to go, okay, which ones, and we've been doing this work, which ones do I actually think are pretty good expectations of me? And which ones are kind of like top down projected onto me that I don't agree with? But at least I had some template to start with. I wasn't just starting in nothing. But I've noticed that maybe in that same vein, maybe there isn't as much expectation now for a lot of younger people around gender and the roles that you're supposed to buy in. And I'm probably going to be in trouble just for even bringing this up.
Suggesting
it feels like it feels like a hot button topic just to even mention this, but it doesn't feel like there's a lot of expectation that's required. It's kind of like, here's the way things used to be expected, and we don't believe that anymore. So do whatever you want.
Right.
And I'm not saying that's wrong either. I'm just saying I think that's harder than to find your own persona through. And because of that, I think a lot of people are going, and that's just one channel, take that and multiply it by all the channels of life. I think it creates anxiety, uncertainty, insecurity. People don't know what's expected of them, and they grow up with a lot of challenge and not know what to do. And so I see a lot of people retreat onto the online space and go, well, at least that's something I can control. I can curate my persona in my social media handle.
Yes.
Or I can take a snapshot of myself and my food or whatever on Instagram really quick or TikTok really fast. This one slice of life, it allows me to hold the pose, take the picture, relax. So I can curate something there and try to look and see what other people are doing and play this game. But then that same person might feel very nervous in a social environment. If someone came up and just started talking to them and didn't go through the channels of the online vetting process or the curation process, why are you talking to me? What's going on? Like, you're breaking protocol. Like, and it's not because they're mad or upset about it. It's because their persona doesn't know how to interface in that moment.
Exactly.
And this isn't everybody. This is just some people I see.
I think that's a great that's a great example, is this idea that like nobody should call me before texting me, or nobody should approach me or ever say hi to me if I don't already know them.
Yeah.
There's I think these rules are exactly what you mentioned. These rules are set up because people are very uncertain about how to behave, and like that's what makes them so uncomfortable. Not because the behavior itself is unacceptable, but because it puts them in a situation where their persona is not sure how to respond.
Yes.
And that is uncomfortable persona work. Now, unfortunately, the more we push away these opportunities to go, okay, well, it's reasonable to believe that somebody's going to say hi to me at some point, or I'm going to have to talk to somebody at some point, right? Even though there's a lot of, check yourself out at grocery stores now, you're probably going to have to talk to a grocer at some point.
Yeah.
So this acknowledging that it is reasonable to believe that we will interface and with strangers.
Yeah.
Means that those are opportunities to go, why haven't I built this skill yet?
Yeah.
Why am I so upset when the world does not meet me all the way on my terms of how I want to be approached?
Yeah.
I probably should be doing a little bit more interfacing. I need to give as much as I'm asking for. Yeah. Do
you remember that thing going around social media? I don't know how long ago it was, probably a couple of years, time of this recording. There was like this discussion. People were insulted by this one woman's behavior. And they were arguing about it online. This woman was pregnant, and she was wearing a button that had how many weeks due she was, because people kept coming up and saying, "Oh, you're pregnant. When's the baby due?" And she got so tired of being nice and smiling and answering people's questions, which I could totally understand. I mean, you probably get asked that a billion times a day. That she started wearing a button, and when they'd ask her, she would just point to the button and keep doing what she was doing, like not even address them, but just like point to the button or flash the button at them, like, here's the data you're looking for. Go away now kind of motion. Not even address the person, just point to the button. And people were like, how dare she? It takes 2 seconds to smile and answer the person's question. And they were really upset by her making, I guess she wasn't making anyone meet all the way on her terms, but she certainly was not persona interfacing with the world. That was her persona now, is just point to a button with the data on it. And it was interesting to see how people were very upset by that. Somebody just taking control of their persona, curating it to what made sense to them. they were really offended. And there's a part of me that's a little bit offended by that too, if I think about it. But then another part of me is like, but I kind of get it, because you feel like you're not assaulted, but you're just overrun with people asking you this all the time.
Yeah.
Right. You don't have any private space when you're out in public. So this isn't easy. These aren't easy answers, right? In that situation, that woman has decided a certain persona that is not interfacing with her environment well. In fact, people are taking it wrong and bad and projecting bad intent onto her because of it.
Well, and you also have to take yourself as an individual into account. Like, is this person going through a particularly difficult time right now? And so it's very difficult for them to show up with a smile for somebody. Maybe they are actually, at the same time they're grieving, they've also recently lost somebody in death.
There you go.
And so they're just really emotionally overburdened. And so they're taking, they're like, I don't want to be totally rude, but at the same time, I can't show up. Versus somebody who is, they just don't want to have to. Yeah. Right. And it's like, okay, that's interesting. Why don't you want to have to? Right. Like, maybe you could be a little bit more generous.
Well, that's some people were saying she doesn't owe you anything. Like, she doesn't owe you anything, information or a smile or anything. No one owes anybody anything.
Yeah. Persona work is, what do we owe to the outside world? It's actually balancing that. Yeah. So I actually disagree with the idea that she doesn't owe anybody anything.
Oh, so you agree that we owe the outside world something?
Well,
not that particular situation.
Right.
I think that might be a hot button issue for a lot of reasons, but
I have more context to say about that to ensure that I don't misrepresent myself there.
Yeah.
Do I think that we owe the outside world everything it asks of us? No, I don't. And in that situation, like I said, I don't know what her situation was. I don't know why she took that action. And so maybe it was all she could manage.
Yeah.
Maybe it was all she could manage. And so she actually was showing up for the outside world in the only way that she could.
Yeah.
So that's the thing about persona, is that we have to take ourselves into consideration at any given moment on the timeline. But we also, when people say you don't owe anybody anything, it's like, that's only if we are in a non-reciprocal relationship to society. Because society does a lot for us at the same time. It's kind of like saying you don't owe any taxes, right? That's the same thing. You don't
drive the roads.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I would say that's
right?
true if you live in the middle of nowhere and you are 100% independent. Yeah, you don't owe taxes if you're like homesteading in the mountains, or, in like someplace up in northern Canada or whatever, and you are 100% self-sufficient. I don't think that person should pay taxes, because they're not taking advantage of any of the resources around them.
Yeah.
But when somebody says, that person doesn't owe you anything, it's like, well, does that mean that they're not taking anything? And what are they taking from society? And the answer is, when we have a high trust society built on smiles and politeness, we take advantage of the fact that we're not killing each other for each other's resources in that moment. Like, civilization is built on politeness. Politeness is something that is perhaps not owed, right? She doesn't owe you anything. It's like, yeah, but she took an awful lot by living in this high trust society.
Well, what I hear you saying is society is built on persona. Yes. Politeness is a curated persona.
That's right.
We're coming back full circle here.
You got it. Yep.
So then that begs the question for me, like, how much do I owe the outside world with my persona? Mm-hmm. And how much don't I owe? How much is it mine, and how much is it somebody else's?
Yes.
How much do you, Antonia, and someone listening right now, get to own my persona? Mm-hmm. What share of it do you get to own? 20%, 10%, 15%, half of it, most of it? I get a very small sliver? Or do I own 100% of it and I get to show up however I want? I mean, I think this is the question we all have to ask ourselves, and I don't think there's one answer to it.
So I think the word own is not the right word. Because you of course you own your persona, because it's what you're choosing to offer. So you wouldn't be able to offer it if it wasn't yours to begin with.
Control or influence, maybe that's better words. Control, or
it's not even control. Like, control's also not the right word.
Okay.
Influence is a better word, I would say.
There you go.
And I think that is exactly the kind of question a person should be asking themselves in order to get to a place of a healthy persona. So a healthy persona is, how do I set myself up for the highest amount of success while at the same time not compromising who I am as a person, right?
So a young woman sitting at a desk and a person walks by and says, smile. Mm-hmm. The person that's telling her to smile believes they own the persona of that person. let's say.
No, I would say
or believes that they get to require that persona
or set
to
the terms of
set the terms, and like you need to set your persona terms this way because
Yeah.
I'm demanding it of you,
What's
or
really
I'm requesting it of you.
What's really funny is that we started this out by saying that we don't talk about controversial things
here we
in
go.
our persona, but now we're mentioning
I've totally
things.
messed it up. I did this. This is all on me. Just throw the hate on me. I'm so sorry.
No,
I'm trying to be as respectful as possible, not give any like it's just openings up as thought exercises. These are real things that people deal with.
100%.
And I think it's a good way to kind of understand it because I think people have this experience a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I have an answer. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
I think it's funny that we're like, we don't talk about controversial things on the podcast, but we totally do.
What's crazy is if you told me that 20 years ago, like someday if you talk about a young person smiling,
Yeah.
it's going to be super controversial on a podcast. I'd be like, what are you talking about? But
Yeah.
I get it now.
So in a situation like that, and I'll just be radically honest on my side, at the risk of being too meistic against society.
Uh-oh.
In a situation like that, I don't think that's a demand. I think what they're communicating is a desire, right? And so what a person has received at that moment is that the environment has communicated to them what the environment would like to see from them, or at least one part of the environment. Now, at that point, and this is why the whole like, well, you don't owe anybody anything. It's like, well, kind of. Like, you don't necessarily have to respond to the request.
Yeah.
Right? Because it sounds like if a person just uses one word, it sounds like a demand, but it really isn't, because they can't demand that of you, right? It's like smile. It's like, no. All right, there you go. You're at an impasse now. But if a person says smile, as in like, that's a request from the environment, then an individual at that moment, and this is why people don't like this, it's not because they don't like the request, it's because it forces them into a place of persona thought labor. Now they have to show some discretion. They have to go, okay, considering where I'm at right now and taking all of that into consideration and considering the environment in which I'm at, and I'm trying to meet the environment halfway, is this a moment when I'm going to need the environment to come towards me just a little bit more? Or is this a moment when I can meet the environment a little bit more? Is it a burden to smile right now? Would it be compromising myself in any way in that moment? And if the answer is yes, right now I'm going through a hard time.
Yeah.
Smiling is not something that I'm able to really do right now in behalf of others. Because, in a work environment, you spend 40 hours a week there.
Yeah.
So you practically, it's not the same as living there, but it almost feels like you spend a third of your life there a lot of times. So there's just going to be moments where smiling is just not a reasonable request from the environment. They're going to see more shades of you. They're going to see more, unless you have a really curated persona.
I don't think the smile is the burden. I think thinking about smiling is the burden.
Exactly.
Putting me in this position is the burden.
That's right.
Not the smile.
Yes.
That's just a few facial muscles. It's
That's
having to think through,
Yep.
is that my sovereign decision to smile right now?
Right.
Do I really want to do that? Is that how do I have resource for it?
Yes.
Or do you have the right to kind of request it of me? Like all these questions that come up when you're asked that or told that.
Yep.
That's the burden.
That's the burden.
And that's
right.
that's what I can imagine myself being upset by if somebody asked me that.
And
why'd you make me have to even say no or even have to go there?
Or think about it.
You gave me a burden now to even have to engage with this. Could you have just not asked it altogether and I would have had a lot easier time of it, please?
And that's assuming that the environment forcing you to consider how your persona is showing up is a burden and not simply your responsibility. It's not your responsibility to smile, but it is your responsibility to consider your persona at any given time in any given environment. It's actually in some ways a favor the person is doing you, because in that moment you have an opportunity to then set a value. When I'm going through a difficult time, I actually don't believe that I don't think that the environment has a right to, ask me to meet it all the way on its terms. So in this moment, I'm going to politely decline. All right. And now I have an idea of my relationship to myself and how I'm going to show up in any given moment, as opposed to, I hate it when people do that. Why did they do that to me? Like they don't have a right to demand that. And then now it's all about the other person. And so as opposed to using that as a moment to get more intimacy with the self and understand one's own, what are the boundaries I'm going to create? As opposed to doing something like that, which is a thoughtful response, going into a reactionary response of anger towards the outside world is actually creating more shadow content, because you've learned nothing about yourself except that you're upset that other people have expectations of you. And there's probably some disowned parts in there, because we do have a responsibility to the outside world. Maybe not in that moment to smile, but we do generally have a responsibility. And those ideas of like, you don't owe anybody anything, that's not actually accurate. That's not entirely accurate. So that smuggles aspects of ourselves that we could be using those opportunities to dive further into. Now, in a context like a work environment where I'm also supposed to be focusing on my work,
Yeah.
right? That could be a moment of frustration. And then you tag it. You tag it and you go readdress that at another time, maybe that evening. Well, I have a busy life. Yeah, but if you're a person of introspection, you're going to figure out a time to think about it.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So I would say in those situations, that's a communication that we as a society we don't train each other into a healthy relationship to persona. And even the person who said smile, okay, now they have their own persona work to do.
Yeah.
They have to figure out why they think that they get to tell the outside world how to show up. Now they probably won't. And is it my job to go tell them so they'll reflect on it? Well, most of the time my answer is no, because it's not my job to do people's growth work for them, right?
Yeah.
Or to help them figure that out. But it is my job to figure that out for myself. And so that person is also overreaching in a situation like that.
So it sounds like this is exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm listening right now, I'm like, this sounds awful. I don't want to have to, every single time something happens, evaluate my relationship with the outer world and how I'm going to showcase myself and all these things. It feels like I'm being asked too much. Like, I don't think it has to be exhausting.
No, it doesn't.
But I mean, it sounds like it's going to be.
Yeah.
Because it's like, I hear these stories all the time of people like, I think there's something around expectation here that's tied to this. There's something around context and discretion. Like every context isn't the same, right? So we have a context, we've got expectation. We also have timelines, I think, too, right? We have timelines around where I am in life. If I'm young, if I'm middle age, if I'm older, elderhood. So all of these factors play into it.
Yep.
So can we start to work on, how do we connect this to something in our real lives if we're listening right now?
Okay. So what's nice is that persona work doesn't have to be exhausting. It's just got a high setup cost. So the big thing about persona is that most of us don't realize that we've already been pre-programmed with a big chunk of our persona. Like I mentioned before, we started it when we were young enough that we were overly influenced by our caretakers. And so most of the time, the persona work we need to do is to dissolve it, right? We talked about that, right? The dissolution of the persona. And that means reevaluating whether or not our persona is actually a true reflection of ourselves or just a reflection of what we believe that the world wanted from us. And so we only showed them the aspects of ourselves that we thought that they wanted. That's handing over way too much power. And then we over-identify with it. So Jung talks about the importance of letting go of an over-identification to persona. And in those moments when somebody says smile, if you're not overly identified with persona, it's probably not going to bother you that much. It's like, no, I'm just in a moment where I'm not smiling. Right. And it's like, and I get to have that. I get to have those moments. It's like selective authenticity. I selected this version of authenticity. I'm just not going to smile right now. And it wouldn't be bothersome. It's like the reason why this sounds exhausting is because initially you do have to do a lot of thinking. And especially if you're going to figure out why you believe you have to hand power over to the outside world, which is not a requirement for persona. Persona doesn't say hand power over to the outside world. It says meet the world in the middle. So why am I handing over too much power? Why is the fact that even being told that is frustrating to me? Right? That's actually the reflection. The reflection isn't the fact that the incident happened. The fact is that I got triggered by it. Why am I triggered by it? Why am I handing over so much power to the outside world? If you have a healthy relationship to persona, in those moments, you'd be like, yeah, I'm not smiling right now. Shrug. Okay. And I'll smile tomorrow because I understand that the world does need me to smile sometimes. Right. And that's me meeting it halfway. So on a practical level, it's going, okay, so how do I reevaluate my persona? Now, this happens naturally in a certain moment of the timeline of our life, and that is midlife. So I've started to see, and actually it was our friend Dario Nandi we were having a conversation with, and he said, it's not a midlife crisis, it's just midlife. And
It's always a crisis.
Yeah, it's always a crisis. And the reason why, according to Jung's work, and I would 100% agree with him because I'm just seeing client after client after client experiencing this, is that in midlife, the thing that gets kicked up, almost like all of the developmental levels of our childhood get kicked up. Like there's a time when we're ready for potty training. There's a time when we're ready to start, asking why about everything and learning how the world works. There's a time period when puberty starts. Like there's all these like markers of, like pretty soon we want to go into dating and mating. And there's another one that kicks on at midlife that nobody talks about. And so when we do it, it feels regressive. And we call it, and we show disdain for it. Oh, it's a midlife crisis. How cliche. But what's actually happening in a midlife crisis or just midlife is that suddenly we start to question our persona.
Yeah.
It just naturally happens. We're like, why have I been showing up this way? In time past, in like maybe the boomer generation, it looked like trying on younger personas that they never got an opportunity to try on. So things like buying a sports car or dating a younger person or divorcing or, buying things that are overpriced or whatever. For our time period of Gen Xers, it kind of looks like, not kind of, my observation has been it's a lot of questioning one's religion they grew up in.
Yeah.
And deconstructing it. It looks like career changes. It looks like, a divorce is very common there too, right? So it's like, it looks like major life, alteration.
So it's a reevaluation of how I've been this whole time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going, is this the slice of myself or the slices of myself that are real to me that I really want to keep showing the world?
Mm-hmm.
And we see people, you're right. Our clients absolutely are doing a lot of resets. They're in transitions.
Yep.
I mean, I think our personal life path mentorship is filled with people in the middle of reset. A lot of them are in midlife because it's naturally happening, whether they want it to or not. And it is a way. It's like, I've been this all this time. Is there a new way to be now?
Yes, right. It's something more honest, right? Is there a more honest way for me to interface with the world? Will the world accept this from me? Is really the big question.
Yeah.
Because before we assumed it wouldn't, which is why we had the persona we did. Or maybe we didn't actually think the world would truly accept the real us, which is why we pinned something on that was just a really tiny slice, or we got an attitude about it and said, screw you, world. And then in midlife, we're like, well, maybe the world will accept me a little bit more on my terms. Maybe I can meet it halfway and be okay with that.
Yeah.
Maybe I can make more space for it and not demand it meet me all the way where I'm at. Or maybe I can have more space for myself in this interaction and assert myself a little bit more and have better boundaries.
So it's a way the boomer, let's say, who's getting the sports car at 45 and the younger person and is acting erratically is chasing their own youthful time period of playful persona. Like they're playing with a new persona just like you do when you're young.
Yep.
I mean, I think that's what young people do.
Yeah. Yep.
That's what I did. I wanted to be the general of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the military at the Pentagon when I was like 13. Like that's what I'm going to be. I'm in the Marine Corps. And I thought this was like, I was going to be this 5-star general. That's what I thought I was going to do with my life.
And then 5 or 6 years later, you're like
I used
developing your own film because you wanted to be Ansel Adams.
Yeah. Right. So I would play Army. I'd literally dress up like it. I got in trouble for having kids in the grade school salute me in the hallways and like all this stuff because I really was playing this persona of like this military general. I'd wear the insignias on I literally played it. And then I grew out of it and I played the role of the artist, the tortured artist kind of filmmaker dude.
Yeah.
And so these different roles, and then you settle down into kind of an adult role in your 20s that you kind of stick with.
Yeah.
More, it's you don't have as much variance, I think.
Yeah.
But
you don't feel like you can play as much.
But I did do a massive reevaluation in midlife in my 30s. It's a huge reset moment.
Yep.
I'm still in the midst of it. I think we're coming to the end of ours that you and I've been through.
Yeah.
So it's a natural progression. So we're going back to be playful. So this is nothing wrong with it. I mean, I guess people do a lot of damage there though. Getting the sports car, dating the younger person, clearly the partner that got split up with or that had to feel the effects of that doesn't feel good about it.
Yeah.
It feels erratic. It feels regressive. It feels bad. It doesn't feel positive and forward moving.
Right.
To anyone involved.
Yeah. But it is usually a sign that the person did not believe they had as much freedom when they were younger to assert their authentic self.
Yeah.
It's a reaction to believing that a persona, like use the word control, own, Like that's oftentimes how people feel in relationship to their persona, is that it's not mine. It's owned by the world and I have to meet the world on its terms, or it's controlled.
Yeah.
But really persona work is discovering that it's your persona. You get to show up however you want to with resulting consequences. And and if you assert yourself a little bit more, I mean, that's why people in midlife also tend to just kind of be more themselves. They're like, I don't really care what people think. Well, we still do. We still care, but we don't care like we used to. We don't hop to. We're not as, we don't modify ourselves as much to accommodate the outside world with like going like, well, what is everybody else doing? That's what I'll do. And so midlife is a time to do that. And so what ends up happening too is because our persona is now dissolving, right? Or we have an opportunity to have it dissolve. We also have the resulting shadow work that starts to pop up.
Yeah. And
that's like its whole different ball of wax. So I know we've probably gone late on this podcast talking about persona, but that's the important thing, is that we almost have an internal time clock that says you should be reevaluating this.
Yeah.
And when our internal time clock does that, there's really not a lot of content created or acknowledgement of how important a developmental level that is for a human experience, midlife. And yet it is vital and crucial for us to do proper, not just persona work, but shadow work, and then eventually get to a place where that integration process is, allows us to be thoughtful elders, right? Wise elders. And as mentioned before, wise elders is the pool of leadership that we almost always are looking to. So persona work, the why, the what, the how does it work, the what if of all of that is the why is because it sets the stage for the rest of our life and sets us up for both success and integrity. That's the why. The what is that the persona is the integration or the interface between ourselves and the outside world, based on what we are going to choose to show at any given time. The how is by allowing ourselves to be flexible and adaptable and show up differently in different contexts without believing that that's us being fake, but at the same time, also asserting values and parts of ourselves into the situation to show that we also have boundaries, that we're not going to just hand ourselves over to the situation just because the situation is asking. But at the same time, we're going to accommodate it if there's no reason not to. And then the what if is, and then what if on a younger level, at a younger phase, we were trained to have this healthy relationship with persona. And the healthy relationship, that adaptability, allowed us, when we do get to that place of almost inevitable dissolution, of the persona, that we didn't have as much shadow work, right? That it's been built up like a plaque because we haven't been disowning ourselves or sort of akitoing it and like trying to not have to look at these inconvenient aspects of ourselves. Like, what if the shadow work is actually pretty minimal? And so it's a lot easier to start the individuation process at that point.
One thing I need to add in here, or I'm going to tee you up to answer this, Antonia, so that we have this recorded and answered. We talk about persona. How does this relate to our personality type? Mm-hmm. So, if I was 20 years ago not knowing much about personality type or persona, I'd be like, well, that's a personality, right? That's your personality is what you show to the world. And the different aspects of that's not persona you're talking about. You're just talking about showing different aspects of your cognition. I'm an INFP. When I was a kid, I wanted to be in the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the military and the Marine Corps. Well, that's more my 10-year-old effectiveness maybe coming out. So that's that side of me. That's my personality. And then I got a little older. I went through puberty and I started to get more into the arts and filmmaking and media production. That's more of my introverted feeling or authenticity inside of my personality type. So aren't we just talking, I'm begging the question, are we just talking about aspects of our personality? And you're calling it persona, but can we just cut through the persona, get back to type? We're personality hacker after all. I'm kind of devil's advocating here. Like, you guys are way down this rabbit hole of persona. Why don't you just talk about it through the lens of personality, the CAR model, right?
Yeah. So what's the distinction between personality and persona is that our personality encompasses a lot more than our persona.
There you go.
Right? Persona is a piece of personality. Persona is the part of your personality that you're aware of, that you're choosing to show the world at any given time. So when you're young, it's a lot easier to play with these aspects and then make them your whole, like, like a huge identity that I had in high school was that I was a Rush fan. All right. That was a big piece of my persona, and that was a big piece of my identity. And it's still like a little bit of it. I don't know if you know, there's like an Easter egg that
Yeah.
anytime we zoom out and you see the whole, sort of set, you're going to see Neil Peart, like a picture of him that says "Exit the Warrior" on the corner, because that still is a part of how I see, that's still a piece of who I am, is being a Rush fan. But it's also like, that's a pretty small personality if your entire personality is defined by a rock band that you're listening to, no matter how cool they might be. So that's right, they're cool. So persona is a piece of, or it's the slice of our personality that we're choosing to show at any given time. And I think the reason why, or how type comes in here, though, is it is very common for our persona to be massively influenced by our dominant or driver cognitive function in our personality type. Very, very, very common. We want to be seen, and this goes into Dr. John Beebe's work of archetypes. We want to be seen as a hero most of the time. And that first function carries with it a heroic energy, the energy of a hero.
Yeah.
So it's very common for our persona to have that be a big influence. So it does go into type a bit, and it gets influenced by our cognition. But it's not limited to that, right? That's why not every person of the same personality type has the same persona. You're also going to be influenced by, again, it starts to come online when you are under the influence, and one could argue under the thumb, good and bad, of your caretakers. So your caretakers are also massively influencing your persona, because you're showing up to be agreeable to them most of the time, or at least in a way that you continue whatever dance they've set up. That could be a very codependent, very toxic dance. And so you feel like your persona shows up rebellious, or, screw you, everybody, but that like maintains whatever dance your caretaker set up for you. And so, or that's just a time period where your persona or your personality is now trying to separate from your parents and understand itself, individuated away from them. And so then there's like the confusing time period where your persona is all about, it's what you're not with, it's what you're not for. And then a little bit later on, you get influenced by the career you choose, or the partner you choose, or where you choose to live, and the society and culture, and what you decide to focus on, which is somewhat, quite highly influenced by cognition, but also just incidentals, right? And your uniqueness that can't be contained into a type. So persona includes cognitive understanding, but it goes outside of it, because there's a lot of other things that come into what you believe the world is asking of you. Right. This persona is as much influenced by your outer world and your environment as anything in your personality type.
Yeah.
And so, and not everybody is raised. In fact, nobody is usually raised in the exact same context. I think about even my siblings. My parents were very different parents for me than they were for them, because we're like, 6 and 9 years apart. So even though we were raised ostensibly in the same family, the context and the expectations were different. So my persona ended up having different understandings and expectations for how I'm supposed to show up, as opposed to my brother and my sister. And then also my brother was the oldest boy, which has very different expectations than myself as the youngest girl. And so there's so many different things that come in here for persona. That's why that's why it can't be modularized. It can't be one and done. It kind of has to stay on a theoretical level, and it has to be a self-reflection. How am I showing up? Why am I showing up that way?
Yeah.
What is the environment asking of me? How do I meet it in the middle? How do I make sure that I'm not being lost in all of this, but at the same time, I'm also not thumbing my nose at the rest of reality? And so type is in here, but it's not the whole picture.
So I think we should wrap this episode up here, because I'm sure it's gone on for a while, and we've laid some groundwork.
Probably too long.
We've laid some groundwork, and this is not necessarily easy stuff to get a hold of, because there's complexity here, and it takes some time to sit with the content, to let it develop, to understand what's actually showing up. But let me just summarize. Let me summarize in a dumb way. I'll do it kind of in a layman term, how I would represent it to myself. Persona is the way that we're interfacing with the world we talked about, like how much or what part of myself I bring to the outer world to interface with them. And what we talked about in this episode is there's a direct connection between my persona, how I showcase myself to the world, And all of the shadow material that is in my unconscious, on my unawareness, there's a tension point here between these two things. And we know that a lot of people are attracted to the idea of shadow work. I think it's kind of a sexy idea, a sexy term for some reason. Shadow work, ooh, it feels like that's exciting and sexy to do for some reason. And if you talked about persona work or dialing that in, it's almost like, ooh, that's like the opposite of it. It's like not sexy at all.
It's the anti-sexy.
So that's really interesting
Yeah.
to think in terms of the persona is the very tool or the very way that I interface with the outer world. And it's like, oh, I don't want to go there at all. I'd rather go into the deep, dark secrets of myself and dig all of that out. I see people more interested in that than the interfacing. So that's interesting. I just think that's a very interesting way that's developed. I would like to talk about that on another episode, honestly. And also talk about practical things. If we're going to do persona work, and this is available for people that are younger than midlife, and it's the most important thing they could be doing, what does that look like? What is it actually, like, what are we actually doing here? We're just talking about it and theorizing, or are there tangible things I can practice? Can I make it operational? Can I make it actionable somehow? Yep. That'd be the question I would be on if I was somebody younger. If I was in my 20s right now listening, I'd be like, great, guys. I buy the premise. I like the philosophy. Now, give me the steps. What do I go do about this? How do I actually practice this in my real life? So I'm prepared for the shadow work later that's all sexy and I want to do. Yep. So I think we could open up the next podcast, maybe start talking about that. And we can dip into the themes of like midlife and elderhood and some of these things. But starting with the practical, what do we do about persona? Yep. Are you open for that?
Yep, Antonia? Let's do it.
All right, great. Well, if you're looking for an action step this week, we don't necessarily have specific action steps except to acknowledge and know that your persona is very important. And if you'd like to get started on your personality type side of all of this, I recommend coming over to personalityhacker.com. We have 16 owner's manuals made for all of the 16 personality types, and we have one for your personality type. Come over, find the one that fits you. It's a great tool to get started on your journey using personality type in a real way in your life, make it actionable. It talks about things like getting into flow, creating an ergonomic lifestyle for yourself, developing an ideal day for your personality. Something called grip trauma, looping, which is where parts of your personality shut off other parts of your personality. They don't listen to the wisdom that you have in your full self. All these phenomena that happen, we have modules that talk about all of these different fixations and things that you have to overcome being who you are. And so I think it's a really great way to help get yourself set up for success in life based on your own cognitive wiring. Come over to personalityhacker.com, get one of those owner's manuals for your type. And while you're there, let's engage with this material on this podcast directly below it at the website. Leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your personal story. What has persona looked like in your life? Do you have a very curated persona? It's a very thin slice, and you don't like to show much range out of that? Are you more chameleon persona? You can kind of flex and flow in any context you're in. What does it look like? What's your experience with it? Have you noticed pain or trauma or suffering from having a more curated or a looser persona? Has there been shadow material that's been reflected to you? Have you seen yourself scared or nervous or uncertain with the persona you bring to the world? Love to hear from you. Again, come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and a variety of Android platforms. And if you leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, that makes me very happy. It makes me feel warm and squishy. So please do so.
Motivates you.
It motivates me. That's right. Helps me show up the next time. We also have a video podcast. You might be watching it right now on YouTube. And that can also be subscribed to. You can like, subscribe, and hit the bell to let you know when future episodes come out. And if you want to leave a comment on that, that would be great as well.
Yeah, my name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker Podcast.